Welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network, with me, Naomi Fowler. You can find this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and all sorts of other podcast platforms. You can also listen to all the Taxcasts ever made on www.tackletaxhavens.com/Taxcast. The Taxcast was just ranked number 10 in Economy magazine's top 50 finance influencers of 2017, thanks to all those who nominated us. Coming up later on the Taxcast.
Land value taxation has got a long pedigree. It's a very sensible tax, but the reason it's never been implemented are because of the political difficulties and the vested interests that stand in the way. But it could generate tens of billions.
We look at land value tax. But first, here's the tax justice news for this month. In the United States, bipartisan bills have been introduced in the House and the Senate to end anonymous shell company ownership. We'll let you know how this latest attempt to bring greater corporate transparency to tax haven USA progresses. Hidden company ownership is often behind the outpouring of at least $1 trillion of dirty money a year from developing countries. And in some ways, US law on this is even weaker than in Panama, where information is at least collected, albeit hidden from law enforcement agencies. In the United States, there's no requirement to even collect that information. In Nigeria, the Civil Aviation Agency has warned of the security risks of around 200 anonymously owned multi-million-dollar jet planes operating in the country, potentially in violation of civil aviation regulations. They've called for a thorough audit on all privately owned aircraft in the country. A lot of it's apparently registered anonymously in Europe. 6 months after missing a deadline to collect €13 billion in back taxes, the European Union ruled that Apple owes the Irish state. Ireland and Apple are near to agreeing a deal to hold the money in a special bank account while appeals against that decision are in progress. Ireland wants Apple to keep all that money so it can retain its bolt-hole status for multinationals looking to minimise their tax bills there. One of the delays was apparently because Ireland wanted to secure an agreement from Apple that it wouldn't sue Ireland if it accrues losses on that money while it's being held there in this special account during the expected 4 to 6 year appeal process. And finally, in Brazil, the corruption-fighting task force that so successfully exposed the huge Petrobras and Lava Jato scandals and high-level political bribery across the Americas has been shut down. Brazil's President Temer is among those politicians facing corruption charges as a result of their work. The federal police say it's bureaucratic reshuffling that's just for efficiency reasons, but prosecutors claim it's a big setback, just as the team was working through new evidence. Those are the news headlines. Now we're going to talk to John Christensen for his take on tax justice news this month. OK, John, so this month we've had some very interesting movement against tax haven USA. Firstly, the EU made a direct challenge to President Trump on financial transparency ahead of the G20 summit in the form of a letter to all EU heads of state. As we said on the Taxcast, the US is the only major economy not to have signed up to the Common Reporting Standard, which is all about sharing banking information between countries automatically. And, of course, it's one of the easiest places in the world to set up anonymous companies. Anyway, this letter basically said that the few remaining countries in the world still refusing to sign up to international tax transparency standards should suffer the consequences and face sanctions for non-compliance. While the media was focused during the G20 summit on the US's isolation from the rest of the G20 nations on climate change, something else really significant and surprising happened. The G19, I suppose, seemed to have got tax haven USA to sign up to a communique basically agreeing that nations not complying to international tax transparency standards must face sanctions. It's really bizarre. I mean, did the US team read the small print before they signed this? I mean, did they understand what they were signing?
Well, it is the most bizarre and extraordinary situation. Did Trump recognise the importance of what he was signing up to in Hamburg at the G20, or does he and his team feel that because the USA is very, very isolated within the G20, and their position, frankly, is extremely weak, that they're now required to sign up. Look, this is very, very important indeed. What happened was, first of all, that the European Union member states are a major part of the G20 process. You had European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker and European Council President Donald Tusk signing this joint letter to the EU heads of state ahead of the G20 summit in Hamburg, saying we are going to take a strong foreign policy position on key transparency measures. These relate to the new international standards for automatic information exchange, that is the common reporting standard, which the US has resolutely failed to sign up to, and they're also pushing very strongly for transparency on beneficial ownership. And of course, we at Tax Justice Network are calling for public registry of beneficial ownership information, so that we, that is civil society, journalists, and a very wide range of state agencies around the world, can have access to who owns these anonymous shell companies registered in dodgy tax havens. And of course, the United States, if you look at states like Delaware and Wyoming and Nevada, these are amongst the worst cases of states which refuse to cooperate, which are totally untransparent when it comes to revealing information about beneficial ownership of companies. So this is an extraordinary step. Extraordinary, of course, that President Trump signed up to it, but perhaps it's a recognition of the fact that the United States is increasingly isolated in foreign policy issues, very unpopular within Europe because of their intransigence, and unpopular with the major international financial institutions because of the fact that the United States is so lacking in transparency, so lacking in cooperation, and so blatant in seeking to attract dirty money flows from around the world.
The logic of all this is that if the OECD and the rest of the G20 countries and EU leaders are really serious, if the US now doesn't sign up to this common reporting standard, are they really going to impose economic sanctions on the world's biggest economy?
It's very hard to say. Yes, it's an important trading partner, but other trading partners are increasing in their importance. And because of the isolationist stance that President Trump and his team has taken, particularly on trade matters, where they're showing themselves to be increasingly moving towards protectionism, it's not inconceivable that Europe and other members of the G20 will say, sorry, this is not acceptable, we will take sanctions. What the nature of those sanctions will be is we've no idea. But I think that the issue here is that there's an increasing determination around the world as economies are coming under greater pressure to crack down on the illicit financial flows, to crack down on the tax evasion, because these are costing countries around the world far too much.
OK, let's talk about another really significant development this month. Members of the European Parliament have approved a proposal that would mean all multinational companies with a global turnover of 750 million euros or more will have to report how much tax they pay in each country where they do business, including outside the European Union. And all that data collected would be made publicly available on a public registry maintained by the European Commission. So, public country-by-country reporting, and that's something which, when the Tax Justice Network proposed it more than a decade ago, people laughed at the idea that companies might actually one day tell us what taxes they pay and what real business they do in each country, rather than bundling it all up into one kind of tally, which tells us nothing useful and allowed all sorts of abuses to go on. Things like secret tax deals with companies like the ones exposed by the LuxLeaks whistleblowers in Luxembourg.
Yes, it is, of course, good news, and this measure has a long history. It was one of the first measures, if not the first measure, that Tax Justice Network started to promote in 2003 when the network was launched. But actually it goes back further. If you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, you'll find that the non-aligned countries of the global south were pushing for much more detailed accounting information from multinational companies. And the reason they were doing this was because most of the capital, that is the ownership of the multinational companies, of course, was based in the north. And as capital importing countries, the countries of the south were losing a great deal of tax revenue. as a result of the bias towards residence over sourced taxation built into the international system. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development was exploring this in the 1960s. They set up a special commission to investigate it in the 1970s. It didn't actually get very far because of resistance from the countries of the North, from the United States and United Kingdom in particular. Now, as a result of civil society pressure, and I think Tax Justice Network has played a very, very key part in this, not least because we drafted the original International Financial Reporting Standard on country-by-country reporting, which other civil society organisations carried through. Finally, after close to 15 years of advocacy and pushing for this, great deal of campaigning around country-by-country reporting, it's been agreed. And you're right to stress that the key thing here is the public disclosure, because if this information isn't public, then not only will civil society not be able to find out what taxes are being paid, what the turnover, what the sales, what the employment costs are in the particular countries, the countries themselves in the south will find it very difficult to obtain that information. So it's all very good news.
It's not all roses and sunshine, though, is it? There are some caveats.
There are some caveats. I think one of the key caveats is the scale, this requirement that it only applies to companies with a turnover exceeding 750 million euros a year. That's far too high. It should be far lower than that, and I'm hoping that that will come down in the fullness of time. Then there's this issue about allowing a derogation, that is, for companies to not take part in this, where they consider that disclosing the information would undermine their competitive advantage. Now, this derogation is a temporary one. There will be a review after 1 year, and the European Commission has committed itself to ensuring these derogations are not excessively granted. But I think this is potentially a very major flaw in the process, because I can well imagine multinational companies putting an awful lot of effort into claiming that this information will undermine their competitive advantage. And that's, I think, where we now need to resist very strongly, because LuxLeaks and other revelations shows that multinational companies have been able to negotiate special deals which are not anything to do with market competition. They are in fact anti-competitive, because they in many cases are simply illegal state aid.
I'd hope, though, that even though this last-minute amendment that was tabled, giving nation-states the possibility to grant these kind of exemptions to companies, governments would be under pressure not to grant them from the public, who I imagine would now know these kind of conversations might be going on.
Well, that's right. And my expectation is that transparency, that is country-by-country reporting, which will help to reveal some of these deals, will actually make states more compliant with the existing rules, for example, around the European Union single market. But the truth of the matter is that tax haven states like Ireland and Luxembourg, Netherlands and Britain have actually based their economic development strategy around doing these deals with multinational companies. In many cases, these deals are very corrupt. It's very hard to avoid suspecting that many politicians are on a merry-go-round of being in public office, helping companies to get these special deals, and then joining the boards of these of the companies, or getting some kind of payback. I'm afraid there's a lot of corruption around this, and I think transparency is the only way of overcoming these corrupt deals.
John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the Taxcast special feature. This month on Twitter we asked you to vote on the subject you'd most like to hear us cover. If you're on Twitter, by the way, follow us on Twitter handle the Taxcast. Anyway, in our Twitter poll you voted for land value tax, and it won hands down. There are many theories and ideas and controversies around land value tax, but not much research on how it might actually work in each country. There's not even agreement on the name. Some people don't like to use the word tax because for them it's not a tax, it's a recovery of economic rent. Others prefer the term site value rating. Anyway, for all the economics students, academics, tax researchers out there, it's a whole area desperately in need of more research. So, this month, we look at the land value tax concept and lessons to be learned.
When you talk about land and power and money, people get a bit uncomfortable.
This is Member of the Scottish Parliament Andy Wightman, who's dedicated much of his working life to land reform and finding fairer ways to raise revenue from it.
For me, fundamentally, this is about power. In relation to land, it's about the governance of land. So it's about how land is owned, how those rights are distributed, how they're exercised, and how they're held, to account. It's a topic which will forever be a topic of political debate. But there's been a great sensitivity about talking about land in the United Kingdom. But I think it's a reflection on the kind of country the United Kingdom is. It's a very unreformed country in comparison to other European countries.
Right, and I suppose in Britain we didn't have the French Revolution.
Well, that's right. And it's interesting looking at countries like France and the French Revolution and the impact that had throughout Europe, where, the aristocracy and the monarchy had their privileges not completely stripped away, but substantially stripped away, and ideas about equality and fraternity were introduced. And that was reflected through political systems throughout Europe. But we still have a legacy. Land relations follow on from that, I think. It's why it took us till 2004 to abolish feudal tenure in Scotland, even though it was self-evident, 50 years ago that should go. And this is why historically, in fact, the landed class argued that it alone had the right to rule, and the right to vote, and the right to sit in Parliament, because it owned the country, and because it was their country, they should make those decisions.
And while the issue of huge amounts of a nation's land being in the hands of very few families is a common thing in many countries, it tends to be something we might associate particularly as a problem in Latin America, for example, but actually Britain's high up there on the scale, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I mean, that in itself raises the question of how we know these things. And, much of the struggle around land reform has been a struggle for better access to information. I did a study of the distribution of private forest land across Europe, and it's very notable that, 60% of private forest land in 18 countries across Europe is held in holdings of less than 1 hectare. In Scotland, the position is entirely reversed. I mean, once one begins to explore the pattern of ownership and its historical origins, I think if one looks at the economy as a whole, for there to be kind of equity and for people to get just rewards, it is wrong that some, usually a very small number, can gain disproportionate income, wealth from the unearned value that accrues from land.
And the best way to paint a picture of that is the Duke of Westminster, whose father passed away, I think, a year or so ago. This is Dave Wetzel, International Speaker on Transport and Land Reform and former chair of the Greater London Council Transport Committee.
The Duke of Westminster is about 26 or 27 years old. He inherited wealth, £9 billion, certainly more than 2/3, I would argue, is land value.
Right, and a lot of the land he inherited is in what have become now very exclusive parts of central London, where people there have to pay him a high annual rent because their buildings stand on this land that he inherited. He didn't pay a penny in inheritance tax, by the way. We discussed this in the Taxcast at the time because of unreformed inheritance law and the fact that the very wealthy, of course, employ lawyers to take care of these sort of things.
The Duke of Westminster owns most of Mayfair, and he's only too happy to accept that payment. I don't think he's entitled to a penny of that as land value. Obviously, if he owns a building on it, then he's entitled to a rent for the building. But the location of that building, I would argue, is not entitled to the rent. If two people want to occupy the same space, then a value arises. When only one person or nobody wants to occupy a piece of land, it has an intrinsic value, but it has no monetary value, no economic value. The economic value arises when two people or more want to occupy the same space. They're competing with each other for that space. They're prepared to pay for it. And it's right that we should collect that payment. But to whom should it be paid? Should it be paid to the Duke of Bedford or the Earl of Jersey? Or should it be paid to the community in order to provide community services? And if we only have a 5% land value tax, and by 5%, I mean 5% of the rental value of the land calculated or valued on the basis of its optimum permitted use. We're only talking about a relatively small percentage of that value. And to my mind, that's the starting position. But once you start collecting it, you'll see many other benefits, and people say, well, why don't we have more of this?
Andy Wightman.
Land value taxation has got a long pedigree. It's a very sensible tax. But the reason it's never been implemented are because of the political difficulties and the vested interests that stand in the way of implementing a tax like that. But in terms of the quanta, I mean, I'm quite clear it could generate tens of billions of pounds for the UK economy, and that money could be used to displace other more damaging taxes.
For the Tax Justice Network, land value tax is definitely an important thing to develop, but not as something that could one day replace all other taxes as a single tax, as some land value tax fans believe. According to Dave Wetzel, how we think about land is all wrong.
Our attitude to land, certainly in economics, is much based upon the neoclassical approach, which deems that land is the same as capital. And that is totally wrong, because capital is person-made. But the site on which the factory stands, or the site on which the office building sits, that is not man-made. That's not person-made. That is a product of nature. It's a part of the planet. And what I argue is that economists should treat land and capital as two distinct features. In fact, there's only three factors of production. One is labour. We can't produce anything without our human labour. Secondly is capital, which is human labour applied to land to produce wealth, which will be used to produce more wealth. And then there's the land itself. And we can't produce anything without land. So there's two aspects to the value of land. It's what you and other individuals, the market, would like to use the land for, and that is controlled or restricted quite rightly by the community through the planning system.
Another aspect of how land value comes into the equation in the public interest is when there are big public infrastructure projects. Here's Andy Wightman on early use of rising land value to finance big projects.
Go back to the 19th century when the railways were first being built in the United Kingdom, and they were built by private companies before the days when government did major infrastructure. A Great North East Railway Company and a Great Western Railway Company. You can imagine the kind of effort that was involved in building a railway from London to Edinburgh. The amount of land that had to be acquired for that required a statute, but it was a statute that was a private act of Parliament giving that particular company compulsory purchase powers. One of the key ways they financed the construction of the railway was in acquiring a bit more land actually than they needed. And then they sold off this land or leased it on long leases in and around the stations along the route. And of course, once they'd built the railway, this land around the station within, say, a couple of miles of the station was now much, much, much more valuable because local merchants and manufacturers could get their goods to market in the bigger cities, ultimately in London, far, far quicker. And they were prepared to pay more for these locations to have access to what was then a very rapid means of transit. So these things were largely self-financing. So the idea of levies on land values to pay for infrastructure has got a long, long, long pedigree. But it's really in the last sort of 40 years that it's kind of gone out of fashion with the neoliberal consensus.
Nowadays, the UK and Europe have governments that play a stronger state role in infrastructure projects, and there are planning laws supposed to be there to protect the public interest and give people a say. Doesn't always work out like that, though. But let's fast forward now to the 20th and 21st century, and an interesting example of how to get contributions to the huge costs of massive infrastructure projects by raising revenue through land values that, after all, will rise significantly as a result. Dave Wetzel worked with Transport for London, TfL, on the extension of one of the London metro lines, the Jubilee line, some of which, by the way, goes through Mayfair, land owned by the young Duke of Westminster we mentioned earlier.
The extension from Green Park through to Stratford, 11 new stations were built, and that cost £3.5 £4 million, and it's been estimated that the increase in land values, just around 1,000 yards of the 11 new stations, was more than £13 billion. And at TfL, we actually checked that figure by doing two valuations around two of the stations, one on property values, that includes buildings, and the other on the pure land value. Jones Lang LaSalle did the study for us. They estimated around Southwark Station and Canary Wharf, the increase was $2 billion for Canary Wharf and $800 million for Southwark. And that was over the land value increase compared in 2002 with 1992. And the reason we looked at 1992 was because it was when this new railway was finally announced it was going to be built. By starting at 1992, we missed some of the speculation that took place because obviously there was lots of discussions going back to the 1940s, building the Jubilee Line extension on various different routes.
The next station is Westminster. Exit for Westminster Abbey and Houses of Parliament.
Now let's fast forward to London's mega £16 billion Crossrail project, building new lines across London. As someone from Birmingham, a Brummie, I have to express my finance curse frustration on why transport in Birmingham and other major cities outside London are so underfunded. But anyway, that's for another Taxcast. Dave Wetzel.
The Crossrail we have funded partly through land value increases. When we argued with government, that was Gordon Brown then was Chancellor, that there should be a land value tax to pay for Crossrail. He didn't want to know anything on the Treasury, didn't want to know anything about a new tax. I was Vice Chair of Transport for London when we were discussing it. And our American advisors came back with the idea of putting in a supplementary business rate on the larger buildings just in the GLA area. And that was accepted by, not only was it accepted by putting in the supplementary business rate, which is virtually all on land value. The fact that we said we could raise a quarter of the cost of Crossrail was the game changer. And that's raising $4.1 billion out of the $16 billion for Crossrail. So, a huge amount.
Indeed. And they could have raised a lot more, apparently, if the British government had allowed them to implement this special levy across a wider area covered by the Crossrail project. That way of raising money is known as uplift. And as Dave pointed out to me, there's a lot more to land value tax than that. But it's a good illustration of what's possible. Now, something I think everyone agrees on. There are two things stopping further progress in this area, probably in many countries. Firstly, there's the huge information gap on who owns land, and that needs to be filled. We at the Tax Justice Network know only too well how ownership is obscured, especially high-value ownership, and an up-to-date valuation of all land is needed. Andy Wightman.
You can go online now, and you can go to Montana, the state of Montana in the United States, Montana Cadastral website, and you can zoom into any parcel of land in the state of Montana, and you can find out, around 100 bits of information for each parcel of land you encounter. Now, I can do that from here in Edinburgh, and you can do that from London. We can't do that for our own country. So we do obviously need a transparent, open, accessible, free-to-use system, land portal, where people can find out not just ownership information, but valuations for that property, planning consents and zoning for that property, the age and size of property and when it was built. So we need a much more sophisticated land information system, and much of that would just involve joining up existing systems that exist in disparate forms around the country and around different bits of government. So people can find this information easier. Then we need, in terms of the sort of fiscal side of things, we need a universal valuation. So we should have universal valuation of all land, and that should be a split valuation. So that the land is being valued and the improvements are being valued. Now, once you have that in place, then you can have a debate about how to tax land. How much could be generating tax revenues is subject of a bit of debate, and the numbers are not entirely clear because the only people who are doing this kind of work are a few independent economists, a couple of think tanks now and again, some campaigners, but government's never taken a serious interest in this topic, and how much we're losing in terms of public revenue by not taxing it efficiently.
You've been listening to the Taxcast. You can read more on Andy Wightman's research and reports on www.whoownscotland.org.uk. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next month.